Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining. I know that you've already sort of added in the chat where you're coming from, but would love for you to, if you can, greet each other with, adding your name, your function. So are you UXR? Are you a product designer? What would you call yourself? What's your title? And then a question that's top of mind for you today. My hope is that you can all participate in this by adding some great thoughts and discussion up front so I can make sure to answer them while we talk. And you can see over on the right, I have a sort of quick agenda for what we'll be talking about today. I've sort of split it up into 5 different chapters. So first we'll sort of go over participatory research, how I think about it, and then we'll kind of go into each of those chapters. Curated outreach, guided activities, creative forums, collaborative deliverables, and rule setting. And then we'll kind of wrap up and we'll kind of move into discussion. So thinking about participatory research. So for me, like when I think about what it is and how I define it, I think of research as a convener. So bringing people together across different perspectives. So if we think about it as that, it's this sort of iterative, collaborative effort that doesn't have a sort of beginning or an end. And it's less of this sort of fuzzy front end that maybe you've talked about or the tip of the spear. And it really is research as a facilitator and a connector throughout that sort of design process. It's a continuum of learning. So if you think about the double diamond model, where you have sort of your early problem definition, and then you have sort of the second phase of execution where you're testing your ideas and you're delivering solutions that work. Research is sort of the facilitator of the divergent convergent process. So if you think of opening up conversations and closing conversations, I often feel that research can be a guide in sort of expanding and closing as necessary. And that happens continuously, right? Many diamonds. You're always sort of building upon these ideas as you sort of refine them and better understand them. And you have new questions, and then you have sort of new solutions and new questions and new solutions. And so that's what I think of. I think of us as facilitators through that convergent, divergent process. And if you think about, like the way I like to think about it too, is it's not just involving the participants in part of the process, but it's also giving them the power and influence to drive that process. So if you're a teacher, you would be familiar with the terms I do, we do, you do. Participatory research is really pushing as much into that we do, you do category. There's a great talk by George I from Greater Good Studio where he talks about the power asymmetry, and he illustrates it as a sort of triangle. So oftentimes when you do sort of maybe more atypical research, you as the researcher or as the designer are designing for that user. If you think about participatory research, it really has the power to sort of flip that power and start to give more control toward that end user. And that's really where I find a lot of value in participatory research. So why do we care about it? I hope that it's a more inclusive process. You're bringing people along the way. You're doing less of sort of driving the insights, and you're more collecting and collaborating on them and building on them. It's also a way to continually de-risk and test your assumptions live. So having these stakeholders and users walk through the journey with you and continually testing those assumptions with them to make sure that you're kind of checking yourself. And it's a way to build consensus and momentum. So oftentimes the more people you have working with you, the more excitement there is, the more you have the ability to make greater change and impact because you're sort of gaining that buy-in along the way. Thinking about that first chapter, curated outreach, who might join and at what level of engagement? I like to think of this as sort of concentric circles. So if you think about the core team at the center, these are folks you're meeting with sort of at a high frequency. There's a lot of engagement going on. If you are sitting in like a technology company, right, that would be your engineers, your product managers, your designers, your UX researchers. And the internal stakeholders, if you sort of expand that scope a little bit, those might be some of the internal business leads, some of the sales and operations folk, other people that have a lot to provide, a lot of expertise, and really build out and round out that core team in an important way. And then you have external stakeholders, customers and consumers. And you want to keep the same contributors throughout if you can. If you can keep the same folks, so say you start early discovery research and you're learning an idea and you're testing out a concept, once you get that concept to a higher fidelity, you go back to that same user and say, I know we talked about this in the beginning, building off of those ideas, we've created this. Can you provide feedback and context to that? So that way they have sort of that fundamental, that sort of foundational understanding, and they're able to apply it later in some of the concepts that you're actively testing. So keeping the same folks throughout, I think, is a benefit. It's not a requirement, but it's a benefit because you get a lot of that buy-in and a lot of that sort of, you don't have to sort of re-explain what you're working on, and they're working on it more with you. It's more reciprocal process. Really important. I think it's not just, I mean, the thing this circle illustrates best for me is that it really isn't just about the end users. Sales and operations team have such rich perspective and expertise in what they're doing, and they're great sources to go to. There's also, I would definitely look at external stakeholders, look outside too. If you're looking at a specific community or a specific need, there are experts and local organizations that serve that community or need are great places to gain foundational understanding for yourself that you can learn from, and also they might help you connect to potential participants down the way. So just making sure that you're aware of all of the experts and you're consulting with them and sort of bringing them into the process. The worst thing I think is when you start going down a path with a project, there's a lot of excitement and momentum, but key experts have been left out, and they're there to sort of, they can poke really big holes, right? If you're not necessarily like checking with them along the way. So always being mindful to have those experts there so that you're aware of the constraints around your project, and you're sort of leveraging their expertise rather than having their expertise sort of poke the holes. And so then kind of like moving on, once you've sort of gathered that group of individuals, and it really is about like your core team is going to help you determine who some of these folks are. Then it's about figuring out what in fact are you doing with them. So like what can they do to engage? And for me, this is like the synthesis by doing. So I like to be a bit prescriptive about what happens and how. So if you think back to those sort of facilitating those divergent, convergent conversations throughout the design process, I like to really, I think like every sort of interaction has a sort of divergent, convergent shape to it. And you want to bring different activities to facilitate the opening of conversation and the closing of conversation. So you want to think about activities like rapid ideation or round robins, concept generation. They're going to be opening up your scope, creating possibilities to explore. And then you have sort of like those winnowing activities where you're converging on things. You're using an importance difficulty matrix, you're doing affinity diagramming, you're voting, you're creating a roadmap, you're scoping and prioritizing the things you agree on. So that can happen in a small interaction like a workshop where you're usually like presenting maybe some of the insights, you're going wide, and then you're trying to find themes and you're trying to organize things in a way that you can then bring them into the next phase of work. So in small sort of engagements, there's that process, but then also in the larger arc of the project as well. And then thinking about those forums, so how to invite and encourage participation so that we're really meeting people where they are. So I think this is, one of the hardest things is like you really are like a project manager, and the logistics are really important. And so for me, I think I spend as much time on the logistics as I spend on the actual insights that come out of it. It really is about setting clear expectations of engagement that's mindful of their time and effort. That's, you're always fairly compensating those who are participating in the process. Maybe if it's internal stakeholders, you can find a way to get them a gift card, right? Because it's in addition to the work that they're already doing. Maybe if it's externals, you can give them, maybe you have more leeway around giving them compensation. But always making sure that you're aware that they're sort of breaking their sort of everyday routine to participate, and that counts for a lot. And then you really want to lower every barrier possible, right? So like, how can you make it so easy for them to hop in, and then also get back to their lives? So I get really, I mean, you saw my agenda when we started. I like to be very clear and prescriptive from the beginning. This is the agenda down to the minute. Purposeful meetings with like a clear objective and an outcome, and really detailed instructions for all of those activities. What is step, 1, 2, and 3? How do you expect them, like what's the mentality when they're doing that activity? Who are they thinking, like what's the mindset? Who are they thinking in terms of themselves? Are they thinking in terms of an end user? And what is the expected outcome of that activity, and how is it going to build sort of towards the final project outcome? So, and then also dedicating time and effort to tech support. So many of the folks that you bring into the process, the more you open it up, the more they're working with tools that they're unfamiliar with. So oftentimes I'll have a lot of easy, like very like easy, low barrier activities in the beginning to get them comfortable with using a digital whiteboard because they haven't used one before. I have alternatives for if that doesn't work. If I need to facilitate it more actively versus having them go into the digital whiteboard and add their thoughts and ideas, always having sort of like alternative ways of gathering information based on their ability to use some of the technology if you're facilitating it digitally, and getting people comfortable too. So like always creating like an easy way to sort of enter into a conversation, and then building upon that and sort of increasing that level of difficulty. Similar to the way you would design like an interview guide, is you go with like the easy questions first. Same thing with the workshop, you go with the easy stuff first and you build and sort of work towards those harder activities later on. Same thing with all the engagements you want to have with your stakeholders and your consumers. And then just really thinking creatively about all the different ways you might gather information, and get feedback. So thinking about gathering information through one-on-ones, through one-on-many, over short periods of time, over long periods of time, trying to expand the methodologies that you use, I think is really important and helpful. You don't want to just stick with interviews and surveys. You want to try diary studies. You want to try workshops with breakout rooms, service safaris, pilot groups. Like I've done tons of like interactive open houses and things. And then gathering feedback, you want to do that both synchronously and asynchronously in both informal and formal forums. So you want to, and you want to use a variety of channels. So you can get synchronous feedback in stand-ups and debriefs. You want to create pauses before and after engagement. So say you're working with your core team, and you're handling a set of 5 interviews in the week, you want to have a debrief session after every single one of those interviews. So you're quickly getting from them what sort of like the top line findings were and what sort of they were keying into. Service safaris are very fun. I see someone asking about it. It's basically finding a service that you're interested and then sort of exploring as a user. So sometimes if you're, say that you're in a financial field, going to a totally different field and going to like a retail shop, and experiencing that specific service, and then trying to take some of the learnings from that safari and sort of like bringing it back to the finance world. So trying to like cross different industries is really helpful. But it basically just means sort of like dog fooding the process, or like, but for another type of service, a different service. Open houses are really fun. I've structured them in very different ways, but essentially just trying to lower those barriers. So saying like, hi everyone, I mean, like the best part about open houses is it's different from office hours in that you can display things. So if you think about going to an open house where there's a lot of materials for them to look at and respond to, and you're giving them post-its to go through those materials and engage with those materials, like an exhibit or something. I find that that's like it's easy to set up. You yourself don't always have to be there. You can kind of go in and out. It's good for you to be there, but it's kind of like this open space where they can kind of come in, they can review materials, and they could provide you feedback over a long period of time. Say you have that the open house going for the entire day, or you have it going, like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Everybody can come in, review the work in a central location. And I don't think it has to be in a physical space. That's where I've done it a lot. But it can also be in a sort of digital space as well. So using open houses, I think, is great. Office hours is great. Those are sort of those informal places where maybe they felt a little uncomfortable joining, a more structured forum, but kind of like walking in as they're on their way to, like another meeting. It's a lot easier for them to get there and provide the feedback. So that's what you're looking for. You're looking for ways to create those moments where you can connect with others around some of the work that you're working on. And then also asynchronous, like allowing for asynchronous feedback around, like if you're documenting things in a repository, making sure that everybody has access to that repository, that they can review and comment, that you're messaging everyone, you have maybe an email thread where you're updating everyone. A website where you're documenting everything, just making sure that for anyone who wants to see, you're an open book and they're welcome to join. So then thinking about the deliverables, artifacts that result from the work. So this is like my favorite part. My favorite part is when you have one of these sort of like collaborative forums where you've got like a workshop where you've got all of these different ideas circulating. You've maybe done some affinity diagramming. You start to build, physical things on top of themselves. You start to sort of like create something. So that can be what are you creating? Like it can take many forms, and sometimes it's not what you expect it to be. Sometimes you're building a journey map and it's more clear. There's a beginning, a middle, and end. Sometimes you're building an empathy map where you're really understanding the pain points and needs of others. But it can be a strategic framework. It can be more about, like in home buyer education, we were really looking at not just a journey map, but we were also understanding the various ways people learned about the home buying process. And that was through nonprofit organizations, through professionals, and then sort of informally. And we created a way of sort of categorizing all those different ways. And is it a personalized experience where it's a one-on-one conversation versus sort of more of generalized experience where they're in an open forum or they're in a class and they're getting more generic information. So it can be just around creating strategic frameworks so that you can better understand the problem you're dealing with, like ecosystem maps and things like that. But it's always really enjoyable because you can take that thing and it can be very low fidelity and very messy, and you can continually refine that with the various groups you're interacting with. And it becomes a sort of like end deliverable and artifact at the end of the project. And oftentimes that can be very visual, it can be very impactful. And then finally, rule setting, really important to make sure that we're doing it right? We hold a lot of power as the facilitator of these conversations. So, going back to that power asymmetry triangle, how can we continually try to push ourselves to flip that power that we have? Right. And it's not, we're always reminding ourselves that it's not about sort of majority rules. that it's really about setting expectations, setting rules of engagement, making sure that like the reason you want to create so many forums is that you don't want someone who is reluctant to be left out, or someone who feels uncomfortable to not have a space where they can provide that feedback to you or provide that insight that you really need. So your job is to really interpret and collect those contributions in an equitable way. So know who you're getting feedback from, realize who you're missing, and make an effort to fill gaps where you need to. Make an effort to always be sort of building enough feedback through the system so that you're not sort of like losing out on perspectives. And thinking about, right, especially for groups that might be hesitant to share or really difficult to recruit for whatever reason, maybe there's a very small segment, building longer timelines. Sometimes it just takes a long, like this process is much more complicated logistically, so it takes longer planning for that longer timeline. Again, reducing barriers and making sure that you're creating forums for one-on-one rather than a group if you feel they'll be uncomfortable, or if it's easier to go through a difficult conversation, having that really curated group that will maybe create a sense of comfort, right? They're all going through it together. Say people are going through the collections experience, which can be really difficult. Having them in a group forum where they can remain anonymous might be helpful because they can share they can sort of see each other's shared struggle through that experience. And always accommodating, different time and location needs. Being able to be there early in the morning, late at night, like working around other people's schedules, because the participatory research project doesn't work if you don't if you can't meet people where they are. And that means that again, people are sort of breaking out of their routine to join. So being able to flex your time to meet them there is important. Ensuring they're comfortable, they have access. Leveraging third-party facilitators is good too. That's important. Say you're a financial institution with a lot of power. It might not be the best for you as the representative of that institution to be hosting the conversation. And so sometimes hiring a third party is the best alternative, so that there is a bit of removed, there's some distance between that institution and that individual's ability to share. And then finally, thinking about places to start. So these are a lot of places I go to build my tool sets. So I think the Luma design system has a bunch of different methodologies that are fun to try out. It's fun to mix and match them. It's fun to edit them and change them so that they meet your needs. Service design tools is a great place. The design kit from IDEO is also a good place to start. Nielsen Norman Group has a lot of great sort of articles that I generally fall into the weeds of. SY Partners is a great little shop that has like a bunch of really thoughtful activities. All of these places, Beyond Sticky Notes, Design Justice, the Double Diamonds, you can see from the Design Council, they have a bunch of really great resources, but I think I'm always sort of like in a collection phase where it's like collecting a new activity, collecting a new way of gathering information and testing it out and changing it. So it's a bit experimental. You want to kind of test out what works and continue to build different methodologies and different sort of activities that you can bring and sort of pull out in any engagement you have through that participatory research process. I think that's all I have for us. I think I talked really fast, so I hope there's lots of questions. But I mean, there's a lot here. I think I sort of boiled the ocean, so I'm happy to go back and sit on any one thing.
Hi, my name is Edith. Thank you, Alexis, first of all, for having us here and allowing us just to come in and hear your expertise around this. So I'm a UX researcher for a non-for-profit, and I'm just curious because at this point in time, our organization really wants to pull in more diverse clients to essentially give us more feedback about our products and services. What we do notice is that unfortunately and disproportionately, we see that more clients of color are harder to engage when it comes to participatory research. So in your experience, um, what is, I guess, some of the best strategies for engaging like those more challenging groups of folks to get them to, yeah, just to even just give us their time?
I definitely hear you. It is really challenging, and I think this is where you really need to lean on experts and in the community groups. So I don't know, in my experience, like I think understanding people whose everyday work involves reaching out to some of these communities, so that you can understand their foundational knowledge, and then also and learn from them, and then also recruit participants through there. Like, by no means would I consider myself an expert in any of these places, and so I think for me it's really about understanding who are the experts who are working with these various communities, especially if they're experiencing if they're experiencing big challenges, systematic challenges, or systemic racism. I think that's an area where I'd want to partner with someone, because I don't know that, like I wouldn't trust that I would have that expertise for it. And I would want to make sure that someone is sort of guiding me through that as much as possible. And I'm sort of leveraging their knowledge and their understanding. I don't know if that like perfectly answers the questions. I'd say you need to find more groups to involve to make sure you're really speaking to those individuals. And then generally speaking, to make sure that I'm recruiting a diverse group, like I certainly make sure that I match any of the, I sort of try to match the national population and make sure that I have a sort of representative sample. And if I don't, I think it's very, very important, right? We're sort of ethically obligated to say this is absolutely not matching the general pop, and we should be aware of that because that comes with a lot of caveats. It comes with a lot of sort of gaps in our understanding when we're missing key groups of people.
One person was asking, they're interested in how to make UXR more representative of diverse populations and rooted in social justice. Do you have any thoughts on that?
What was it?
How to make UXR more representative of diverse populations and rooted in social justice.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, it is really about the participatory research process and making sure that we're bringing people along with us. So I think the more we can bring the users closer to the business and sort of bring them in the room, the more we can influence or have those sort of users influence and drive the conversation. I think it's really challenging to do, but I think in the very beginning of the participatory research project, there is a lot of sort of growing pains. The timelines are longer. There's a lot of logistics involved. It requires a lot more work for everyone because you're requiring people to do work with you. But the more they do that, the more they start to see a lot of the value, and they start to, you're bringing people in as with lived experience, and they're able to connect with them as humans, and that I think it takes a while, right? I think it takes sort of building that muscle. But after a while of building that muscle, you start to see the benefits of it. But I can't say like I haven't figured that out, but it's something I work every day to try to figure out.
Great, thank you. And we do have a list of questions, so I'm gonna lob one more your way. So can you talk a little bit more about participatory research described from a UX perspective? We have somebody coming from an anthropological background. I think if you can provide any context there.
Yeah, so from a UX perspective, I think really the big difference is that oftentimes you as a researcher are reminding everyone that the solutions don't have to be digital. I often, like, I work in UX, but so many times there are solutions that are about facilitating communication between different parties, that can be simple. That doesn't have to be a huge technological lift. So I think in one way you're trying to sort of break UX and say it's not always a UX solution. Sometimes it's a process solution. You're sort of acknowledging that. And then in another way, you're also working with a lot of folks who are creating some of these more complicated digital experiences, whether it's an application online or it's a logged in experience with a home feed. And you're trying to, I think the hardest thing is sort of like being able to recreate that experience for participants, and sort of give them the full context of this is where you start your scenario, this is where you end your scenario, and showing them those sort of live prototypes and getting them to move through that prototype and provide really robust feedback. But so some of it is working with all of those different prototypes and those tools to get feedback. And then other parts is trying to constantly challenge whether or not those prototypes are going to fulfill the full mission, or fulfill that need for that end user, and how can we ensure that the machine and the humans are working together. And that goes into like sales and ops too. Like, how can we make sure that the digital experience is facilitating and sort of supporting the sort of operational experience and the conversations that are happening, and how are those conversations then also being sort of translated in the digital space. So I think that's often where it is. It's like sort of like moderating those two sides.
So can you share best practices and considerations when planning or facilitating participatory multilingual UX research? Can you tell us a little bit more about what are the main roles in your core team or design operations that help you do this job? Because it sounds like you're wearing multiple hats. And how do you manage it all?
Yeah, yeah. So like half of it is research, and then half of it is like all the other stuff, which is like all the logistics and stuff. I really try to plan for it. I try to limit the capacity of the team, and I try to only take on what is the highest priority for the business. Obviously, right? We're supporting the business, and then the highest priority in our perspective for those end users and members. And usually I spend a very long time scoping to make sure that those few things that we do are the most important things. And usually they're, I find that like the more people who talk about it, the more there's a need there. And I definitely, I don't take on nearly as it's about being able to say no to a lot of things, and then spending time to scope, like taking a full few weeks to scope out something rather large, and then planning that out collaboratively. And the core team looks, I mean, for example, the core team can be someone from, usually I like to make sure they're really cross-functional. So it includes marketing, it includes ops, it includes sales, it includes the business, it includes me, a designer, a product manager, and an engineer. We try to make sure that there are sort of representatives from all of these different sort of from every department within the company. And if they're not part of the core team, which I get pretty lucky, I get to usually, I get those types of core teams. If they're not part of the core team, then I make sure that they're internal stakeholders, and I try to pull their ear as much as possible, and create like milestone updates with them, to sort of catch them up to speed, and make sure they can't avoid giving me feedback.
That's helpful. I do agree that stakeholders are sometimes difficult to get their attention. I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit more about about those meetings that you have with them? How do you really keep even your stakeholders engaged for those moment by moment updates?
Yeah, so I try to be, again, it's about being really clear and consistent with how you schedule people's time, understanding that they have a finite amount of time. They have to come in, they have to provide feedback, and they have to sort of swoop back out. So for me, it's definitely, I like to have a clear agenda, a clear topic for conversation. I tried to create, I will say, I tried to create standing meetings where I had, because we had so much work going on, I was like, great, we'll just have a standing meeting and we'll go through the research that's like, top of mind that time. That to me worked out fine when there was a clear project, but it sort of fell apart after that. So I prefer not to schedule standing meetings at all. I don't like to have reoccurring meetings at all. I actually like to just schedule a meeting every time we have to talk about something specifically and say, this is the meeting where we talk about this. So that doesn't mean that like once we get into a rhythm and we have like a project going where I have a few folks that I do want to have a standing meeting, I don't have those. I do. I'll have like a weekly standing meeting, but it'll be very sort of with a small core team that I'm constantly working with. And it'll be sort of that collaborative point for us. But I think overall, I try to make sure that when I do request their time, I have a topic, I have a pre-read, they're coming prepared. And usually that helps with engagement.
Great, thank you. Those are some really tactical items. I feel like I can bring all of those to my day-to-day work. Let's see, I do want to give you another question. Can you tell us a little bit more about different strategies for conducting participatory research with users from different age groups and different cultural backgrounds?
Oh, that's a really good one. I think I actually think that one of the great sort of strength of activities is, generally speaking, the barrier for entry is so low. Like if you think of like rose, thorn, bud, like rose, what's great, thorn, what was not working, what was difficult, and then bud, where's an opportunity. They're very sort of simple things to understand. So generally speaking, having those guided activities usually levels the playing field across all different sort of types of users. So I definitely think that facilitating the conversation by getting them to do an activity is a really great way to make sure that even if it's across different ages, that you're sort of making it simple and easy to join. Yeah, I definitely think that a lot of the activities usually are fairly simple. Like a bullet diagram is like just what's top of mind. Start throwing important things in the middle, less important on the outer edges. Fairly easy and simple. It gets complicated once you start building those things out, right? Like once you then take the bullet and then you move it forward, and you try to create categories, but hopefully at this point, they're working with you through some of this stuff. So again, they're like also learning and growing capacity and growing their own expertise in some of these methodologies along the way. So they're able to kind of follow you and kind of up level along the way as well.
And kind of in the same vein, so thinking about, so we have remote versus in person. I think a lot of us are fully remote. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we can bring that same level of engagement and activity to even remote sessions?
Yeah, I don't think remote sessions can be as long as like in-person engagements. There's like a cadence to the in-person engagements where you could have like a 4 hour long thing, you could have breaks in between, and you could still have really high engagement throughout. The same is like not true for the digital world. So, or, I think if you are sort of meeting, if you're meeting virtually, I think it's really like 2 hours max you can hold people's attention. Generally speaking, I don't think much, like I try to get at least an hour for a workshop activity. So you are requiring a lot of time from a lot of these participants oftentimes. So an hour, 90 minutes is best. And if it's virtual, you can't go above 2 hours. But I think often with virtual, it's about like slicing things and being able to come back. So it's like part one happens now, part two happens later in the week, part three happens next week. So I think it's about creating like bite-sized pieces, and taking something that maybe you would normally do over the course of an entire day, it's a design sprint or something, and actually slicing and dicing it so that it happens over the course of a week or the course of a couple weeks, when you're doing it virtually.
Thank you. And we are getting a few questions about research repositories. So I do want to turn our attention to this. Can you tell us a little bit more about, do you have a research repository that you go to kind of synthesize some of this information? Or is this kind of all new generative work that you're creating? If you can just tell us a little bit about that.
That is a great question. I've been working on research repositories a lot. So we don't have like a specific tool that we've adapted for a research repository, though I've looked at like all of them, and they're all like they all have their advantages and disadvantages, right? But I think it's really about, like, right now we use Google Drive, and so I have everything organized. I have like a clear file naming convention. So it's very easy for anyone in the company to kind of jump in and find what they need whenever they need it. And then we do have like everything sorted in a large library. And that library is like a Confluence board. But I guess what I would say about research repositories, it is really honed into the tools that people are using every day, especially when it comes to participatory research. You want to meet them where they are. So you want to use the technology that they're going to be in already. If a lot of the people in your organization are using Confluence, try to use Confluence. If a lot of people are using, you know, if they're using Google Drive, meet them in Google Drive. I think it's like a yes and. I do want to test out some of the new tools that are out there. There are some cool things happening, especially with being able to sort of read and analyze transcripts and summarize them with AI. I mean, there's really cool stuff happening that I think you should always be experimenting, looking at new and different places. So I've looked at Marvin, I've looked at Enjoy HQ. I've looked at, there's Look Back. So there's a ton of really interesting, there's Dovetail. There's a ton of really interesting ones out there that you can look through. But I definitely think that it may require some adoption and comfort from the company to go to one of those tools. So first and foremost, if you're trying to build support, use the tool that everybody else is using as your repository, sort of make it work, and then build the case for something new.
You are leading me into my next question. How do you push for the representation that you think is appropriate when your stakeholders aren't really willing to prioritize it? So it sounds like leveraging the existing tools that they're already using, making it as easy as possible for them. But I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about how do we really convince stakeholders that this is important to the work?
Yeah, are you talking about tools or getting participant recruitment?
Recruitment, so that like participant mix and representation.
Yeah. I think it's something that you continue to make a case for, you continue to bring up, and you continue to build in your own practice. It might not be something that they're interested in or they're looking for, but I think the more you can say this is not a representative group, or this is a representative group and this is why it's helpful for us, being able to compare, our sort of like typical customer to a representative population is usually really interesting. You'll see that there are gaps in who you're serving, and how you might be able to find new customers elsewhere if you are more representative. So I think you have to speak in their terms and make business cases. But for me, I always try to I try to get a fairly representative sample of folks. I try to get a diverse perspective, and I kind of just make that one of my that is one of my sort of principles when I'm conducting research, is just make sure you're getting the right people. and make sure you're sort of, I mean, definitely have a recruitment platform that you're using to get, diverse group. I have had folks say like, can't we do this quick? What's like the down and dirty version of this? I generally, I don't do that. The answer is there is no easy way. It all requires effort. It all requires careful recruitment. Getting feedback from a neighbor is not a representative sample. Don't do it. Don't do it. You never read that Slack message. I don't know where it went. I generally, I will sort of like approach the conversation and say, this is why we don't do it that way. It really, it adds a level of risk to the project if you're not being representative. And so I'll make the case, but I definitely think like, I just say like, that's not in fact how we conduct research.
Great. Those are great rules of thumb to really stand by and plan our work around. So in this same vein, as we're thinking about recruitment, are there ways that you kind of select different participants so that you think the activities can be more active? Maybe you think that someone is more likely to be more engaged. Are there ways that you're picking out those individuals?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of times I will flex the activities to meet the participant. So some people are really good at one-on-one conversations, and the Q&A format is simple, easy, they can talk forever. I do more questions with them and I don't flip over to the activity that I have, right? Maybe they're just telling me all sorts of great information. They have great stories. I don't really need to pull out the activity. Other times, and usually it works this where like one is more helpful than the other. Other times it's like the activity is really where I can get them talking because they're able to see a framework or a structure. They're able to start filling in things. And that's when I get the best information. So I'll spend more or less time on something depending on how receptive they are. And I'll sometimes pivot and change activities if I find that like one is just not working. So I like to have like a backup idea ready to go. And then if that like first activity, say it's a journey map, one, maybe I put all the steps in wrong. Two, they don't necessarily have a clear idea of why I want all of these different swim lanes that I've outlined. I'll say, you know what, let's move away from the journey map and we'll just do like a quick, easy bullet diagram. So like simplify it into a simpler, easier activity. But usually it's like you kind of like flex to meet them where they are. Everyone has good information. Generally it's like I try to sort of find the thing that works the best with them. And you'll have conversations where like you get really amazing, fascinating insights, and you'll have other conversations that maybe you didn't like quite click and like get to the spot you wanted to be. But that's also okay. You just make sure that you have enough participants where you start seeing those patterns reoccurring, and you're able to sort of make up for participants who weren't sort of freely sharing.
And I think you're starting to answer our next question. So how can you share any tips for generating insights from interviews where the interviewer activity didn't necessarily follow that strict agenda or scripted questions? So I think you're starting to kind of describe some of these things for us, but can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so many times the script can fall apart. I try to be really careful about what I'm planning. I know all the questions I'm asking. And then I realize that they're in a role where it doesn't make sense for me to be asking the questions that I'm asking, or they're sort of like responding in a way that makes it very clear that like, I'm sort of like, I'm not getting sort of like the most out of the conversation. They're sort of like quickly and efficiently answering the question and kind of moving on. Generally, I try to like give them more control when it gets to that point. And I say like, tell me a time when, or like, how would you, like, if it's someone in a sales role or something, I was like, can you tell me about like a really memorable moment or something? So I try to get them storytelling. And if I can get them storytelling, then usually I can sort of like reorient myself and like, one, have a better set of questions maybe. But two, like, I start to understand where they're coming from and I get that greater context so that I can sort of like change and pivot direction, and I can get more engaged in the conversation. But definitely, I think being able to sort of like pause, give them a space to sort of like tell you a specific story, and then sort of reorient yourself after that is really helpful. I mean, I've also had workshops where I had an agenda, I had sort of like a set topic, and the entire thing broke down, right? I had like a mutiny. um, and usually it's for a really good reason, right? I like sometimes people have experienced really tough things, and you have to have a really difficult conversation. Like they're not ready. They are not ready to engage with you. They don't want to hear your exciting activity you have planned for them. They just want to tell you what's going on. So you do not do that exciting activity and you lean into the conversation. And I mean, I've had it where we're just all sort of like sitting in a circle or standing in a circle, and I'm listening to the stories that they're telling. They're building off of each other in a conversation, and it becomes a focus group. And that's okay. That's okay. I think like the most difficult thing is to try and like force it down a path if you can tell that like the atmosphere in the room isn't receptive to it. So being able to throw out your plan, and sit and listen, that always works, because generally the reason it goes off track is because they have something they need to tell you. So you just receive that information, and then change course.
So you obviously have a really diverse tool belt, and you've conducted a lot of these different types of research activities. Can you tell us about some of the ways that you pick the teams that you're assigning? So like how you would execute a research activity based on the existing expertise that you have within a team.
Yeah, as in like choosing teams like within a workshop, or like creating groups and things.
Yes, like on our side as the researchers who are conducting the research, maybe we're more inclined for one type of activity. How do you plan around those types of things?
Right. And I don't know if it's, so tell me if I'm not answering the question right. But generally speaking, I like to put people together who don't usually work together or talk to each other, so that they can form a new relationship. They can understand each other's perspectives. I try to like mix folks as much as possible. And then I always try to experiment and test out new activities. And generally, like, if you want to try participatory research, I would certainly recommend that you like first try it on yourself, try it on your research team, try a quick postmortem on your research team around like a recent project where you're saying what worked, what didn't work, what could be improved. Facilitate it, do the whole agenda, go the whole sort of 9 yards with the logistics and stuff to set clear expectations, and then gather feedback on how that went. And then start opening up those circles and try it with your internal stakeholders, and then try it with external stakeholders, and try it with customers, and try it with the end sort of consumer as well. So like start small and build out. And then certainly like try to, when you do facilitate those activities, just like mix people up so that there are different people talking. And then as a researcher, I never participate or sort of like add. I'm always sort of like walking the room, encouraging folks, clarifying directions. But I find that it's best when I sort of like allow them to be contributing their thoughts and ideas. And then I'm the connector and the facilitator. So I'm connecting it back together with them. But I'm not the one who's like sort of participating in the activities.
And let's see, we just got one in from Megan. Do you have any advice for conducting interviews with individuals that have very niche or specialized roles? How do you navigate conversations where some of the responses end up going away? going way over your head?
That's a really interesting question. I would say, and I think this is like something that I've sort of specifically sought out to do, is to build my expertise in a specific industry. So for me, it's been really important that I can build my expertise in the financial sector, and specifically fintech. Like, I want to better understand loans. I need to understand, like, in amortization, how amortization works, in order to better understand how to create a simplified, seamless mortgage process. So, like, for me, I think I probably experienced that a lot in the very beginning when I started working at Fannie Mae, where I had no idea what was going on, because there were a lot of really specialized roles and a lot of stuff was sort of over my head. And I spent a long time building up that expertise. I guess what I would say is, if you're not looking to become sort of specialized as a researcher in that type of industry or in that area, then give yourself some homework if you feel like the conversation is going to go that way, so that you can at least have sort of some foundational understanding, and like, don't feel bad asking clarifying questions. Please, like, ask the clarifying questions, because if you're not getting anything from the interview, there's no point in having it. So definitely, like, be like, actually, I'm so sorry, but I do not understand what you're saying. I need you to please try again with me. I'm willing to learn. And that could be a really helpful experience for both them and for you. So I definitely would not try to continue to have that conversation where you can tell you're already going over your head. I would definitely sort of be really transparent and honest about that. And then be willing to sort of learn. Yeah.
What can you share about accessibility guidelines when recruiting and engaging users through different mediums? And we also had one about recruiting users that are using assistive technology. So accessibility and participatory research, huge can of worms, but what can you share with us?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a really good question. I mean, I certainly like, there are some really wonderful, robust, like, accessibility standards, at least in the UX world, that, like, we should all work very hard to build toward, and make sure that everything that we're building is really truly accessible. So I would say, like, I really lean hard on the standards that have already been set to make sure that we are in fact checking the boxes for accessibility. I think it's hard to recruit those who would use assistive technology, but I think that's a great thing to be working on. I haven't in my experience done that. And I've leaned on more of adhering to the standards and really making sure that we're aware of them and that we're working toward them. And then I think, I mean, I do think that if you have, like, hopefully there is someone whose job it is to think about accessibility, and you can learn from them and partner with them. But maybe if there isn't someone in the company who's dedicated to accessibility, you can partner with an outside organization. Again, reminding yourself that you don't have to be the expert, but you should find the experts and partner with those experts. So if you can find someone who is an expert in accessibility, not only can they help you better understand how to recruit for these individuals, they can also build your foundational knowledge in that space as well.
Great, thank you. And I see Anthony's also dropping some links to some of our previous events in the chat, if you're interested in learning more. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Alexis. I know this has been a really great discussion, and I think our team is really excited just at the number of questions and your candor and your responses.